Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Sagar. So we'll be having mentor speak session today by Akanksha. So Akanksha is one of the mentors of Equinox. She has a MSc degree from KU Leuven, Belgium in the field of astronomy and astrophysics. Her research interests focus on addressing questions related to stellar evolution using numerical techniques. She wishes to combine interests in stars with her experience in numerical simulations and computing, along with radio astronomy to probe further into the star's evolution that could help her better understand other high energy astrophysical objects such as pulsars, radio galaxies, black holes, etc. So, welcome Akanksha and thank you for joining. So, we can begin the session now.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So they've already introduced me. My name is Akanksha Dagor, and today I'll be giving you a very short description about introduction to stellar astrophysics. So in this session, I'll try to cover the basics and the fundamentals about what happens inside the stars and something related to the dynamics about the properties of the stars. So I'll begin the session, and firstly, I'll share my screen for that. Just give me a moment. Right. Okay. Let's see. Yep. Okay. So is my screen visible to all? Can you just confirm with that?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Great. So, yep. Okay. So I'll begin the session now. Again, a small introduction about who I am. So my name is Akanksha Dagor, and I completed my master's in astronomy and astrophysics from KU Leuven in Belgium. And I recently, did my thesis regarding stellar astrophysics. I was studying about the stellar winds, especially the metallicity parameter, how it affects the stellar evolution on massive stars. But I'll get back to that later during the session. So basically, if you want to connect with me or you want to know more about what I do, you can always find me on LinkedIn. My username is given on the screen.
Sorry to interrupt, but I believe you are sharing just your browser.
Is that so?
Yeah, it's showing the Zoom. And it's showing the Zoom page.
Yes, it is actually your browser is being shared.
Okay. Well, I did. Okay, just wait. Right. Nope.
Maybe you can stop sharing and just share that particular tab, perhaps.
I think I'll do that. Just a moment. Yes, I'll try to do it now. Yep.
Yeah, we can see it now.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, I already gave my introduction. I won't waste time on that again. So proceeding on. So basically, before starting the session, I would like to talk a little bit about myself, what I've been doing so far. So basically, I did my bachelor's in physics honors from Hansraj College in 2015. And in 2015, I graduated with a degree in physics honors, first division. And after that, I was very focused on doing research and studying more about the stars, specifically about the evolution of stars. So keeping that in mind, I enrolled at the University of KU Leuven in 2019. And after completing my degree in 2 years, I graduated with my MSc degree. And currently, I'm still preparing my applications for further research work in scientific tasks and specifically in stellar-related fields. So that's what my journey has been so far. And today's session will be talking about some basic fundamentals and dynamics associated to stellar astrophysics. So I assume that many people would be here from different backgrounds, from engineering or science or any other branch. So keeping that in mind, I've kept this presentation very brief so that I'll be able to explain the stellar astrophysics phenomena in very simple terms to you all. So after that, we'll have a question answer session. So you can always ask your doubts after this session. So moving on, the first question that we talk about is, what exactly is a star? There are many definitions about what star is. Some might be very complicated. But if somebody asks you in very simple terms what a star is, you can always say that it is a ball of gas which is held together by its own enormous gravity. So it's just a ball of gas floating in the universe in space, and which is held by its strong gravitational force. And that's why, because there are so many nuclear reactions going on inside the core of the star, we see it twinkle. So that is very basic definition of what a star is. The next question that I would like to talk about is, what is the importance of stars? I mean, they are so distant away from us. Why should we talk about stars in the first place? Well, talking about from our ancestors, well, for them, stars was something of very historical importance because it helped them navigate, it helped them predict the seasonal changes. But that is for them. Okay, we can always say that now stars help us to navigate and predict the seasonal changes. But the next question that we should talk about is, why should we study what's happening inside the stars? I mean, there are so many processes going on inside the core of the star. How does that help us in the present world? So my answer to that question would be that everything that is around us is because of the stars, and in fact, because life exists due to the existence of stars. Whatever elements that are present in this universe come from what happened inside the stars, and after the star died, all the elements were present or distributed to the different places in the universe. And even we ourselves are made of stars. So that's why I believe that studying stars is very important in that aspect. Like I said, there are numerous stars in this universe. Astronomers have predicted that there are around 200 billion galaxies, and our Milky Way galaxy alone contains billions of stars. So I guess our astronomers estimate that there could be like numerous stars in the entire universe. But since there are many stars in the universe, not all stars are alike. Every star is different in different aspects. So the first classification that I'll be discussing with you today is the classification based on the mass of stars, basically the size of the star. So starting with this, there are a few categories of stars, which you can see on your screen. The category is from O, which is the most massive category of stars, to here, which is M, so the least massive category of stars. And our sun is especially a G-type star, so you can see it is relatively very small as compared to that of an O star. So the stars which are O and B, these stars are typically considered as massive stars, whereas stars which are G, K, and M are considered as least or less massive stars. So this was just a basic idea about the classification of stars based on their mass. Now, beginning with the classification, I'd like to discuss more about this diagram, which you see on your screen. It's called the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram. And it is basically just a scatter plot of stars that are put on this plot with respect to the temperature and the luminosity. So you can see sun on your screen here. It's a G-type star, which is considered a very least or very low massive star as compared to the stars which are very massive over here, that is O and M type of star. So basically this diagram it depicts the relationship between the surface temperature and the stellar luminosity. So this plot that you see on your screen, this diagonal, is called the main sequence. I'll discuss more about this in the later slides. So what happens here is that all the stars which are lying on this diagonal of the main sequence are actually burning hydrogen into helium in the core of the star. So basically, once the hydrogen gets exhausted, the helium starts fusing to form other heavier metals. We then say that the star is said to have left the main sequence, and it moves on to its giant or supergiant phase. So that's just a basic diagram of what a scatter plot of this is. So after that, I would like to discuss some very basic stellar physics principles with you all. Okay, so in this slide, you see that we'll talk about hydrostatic equilibrium. So in this slide, you see that this is just a small representation of the diagram of what happens inside a star. So here, the fusion takes place inside the core of the nucleus, due to which the energy is released because of the nuclear reactions that are happening inside the core. So because of that, there's a pressure which gets exerted due to the core towards the surface of the star. And similarly, there's a counterbalance of force, which is due to the gravity. So gravity tries to compress the material which is inside, whereas the fusion of the star, what happens inside, tries to push the material away. So there is a constant equilibrium. There's a constant tug of war of force between them. And since the star is very stable, you don't see the star exploding or you don't see the star contracting. So this is because they are in quite a hydrostatic equilibrium. So the forces are balanced, and here you see the equation on your screen. So as this is the hydrostatic equation, and since this is an equilibrium, what you see on your screen is basically the equilibrium state for the nuclear fusion and the gravitational force due to the star. So further, I'll talk about the nuclear fusion reactions due to which the energy is produced inside the star. So energy is produced in the core of the stars through the process of nuclear fusion. And in this nuclear fusion, hydrogen atoms combine to form helium. And once hydrogen gets exhausted, then the helium atoms that perform, they fuse over to use more heavier elements. And once that happens, then the cycle goes on until fusion is no longer possible. But that is something we'll discuss later on. So the energy is produced in the stars in form of two basic cycles. One is the proton-proton or PP chain reaction, and the other is the carbon-nitrogen or CNO cycle. So I'll just give a very brief description about what they are. So the PP chain reaction you see here is basically proton-proton chain reaction. So this is one atom of hydrogen and another atom of hydrogen. You see here a simple schematic diagram which represents the formation of a deuteron. And over here, again, you see another PP chain cycle going on. And similarly, these two results in the production of a helium-3 isotope. And once they combine, you see that two hydrogen atoms are released while a helium atom or a helium molecule is formed. Similarly, what happens in CNO cycle is that here it's the CNO cycle, like I said, stands for carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. So here, to produce helium, we are not only dependent on hydrogen, but we also require the use of carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen elements, because here they act as catalysts. And once, like you see on your screen, carbon reacts with a hydrogen, you see a gamma photon is released, and then nitrogen, then it reacts with a nitrogen atom, and then it's like a cycle which goes on. And here you see the end product over here is a helium atom. So you see that it's a very complicated cycle and it's slow reaction cycle. So the massive stars are some stars that are actually larger than the sun, or typically more than 8 solar mass. So those stars actually CNO cycle going on in their cores, whereas the PP chain reaction cycles are those cycles which exhibit those stars that have less mass than the sun. So this was just a rough idea of how things go. And due to that, since you see in the CNO cycle that a lot of hydrogen would be used to complete one cycle, therefore, due to this, the consumption of hydrogen atoms inside the core of massive stars is actually very large. And this is one of the reasons due to which massive stars tend to live a short lifespan as compared to the less massive stars. So this was just, yeah, a basic representation of the chain reactions that are going on inside the core of the star. Now I'll just talk about the life cycle of stars, that how stars evolve during their lifetime. So we'll first talk about how stars are formed actually. So the first point I'd be discussing here is the molecular stars, that the molecular clouds in the interstellar medium are nurseries for the birth of the stars. So basically the interstellar medium has the molecular clouds in them, and these places are active star forming regions because they are full of elements which are used for the production of new stars. And these places act as nurseries, like I would say, for the production of new stars. And once the cloud or dust, once the cloud of dust and gas satisfies the criteria of Jeans instability, it collapses under its own gravitational force. Now, Jeans instability is a criteria set by research by research that was conducted by various astronomers and astrophysicists. And they concluded that once a cloud of gas compresses under its own gravity due to certain reactions going on, and once it starts compressing, there's a certain limit after which it becomes stable. So here, this stability is set by the Jeans instability. And once this condition is satisfied, we actually get a small, or I would say a relatively small cloud of dust, which no longer would contract or no longer would expand because it's now reached a state of equilibrium. And that's why it won't collapse further under its gravitational force. And now after reaching this stable stage, we say, that is the stage of hydrostatic equilibrium, we say that a protostar is formed. So protostar term is actually the term used to describe a just or a newly born star, which has just begun to fuse hydrogen into helium in its. So it's a very young star in terms of that. And that's why we say that star is literally born in this case. And what you see on your screen is an image of this W51 nebula in Aquila, which is a very active star forming region. And it's one of the star factories in the Milky Way galaxy. So now once the star is formed, the star then places itself on the main sequence. We'll come back to this diagram again. So after a protostar stage, we see that the star, all these stars you see on this diagonal are actually fusing hydrogen into helium in their cores. So that's why we say that they are on the main sequence. And to come to this stage, we first, the star actually goes through a zero age main sequence, which is called the ZAM stage. And like I said, this is the very initial stage of the star as it continues or as it progresses towards its lifetime. And at the main sequence, the star is actually very, very stable. So the star stays at the main sequence for 90% of its life. So here, it's a very stable phase. And again, there is no contraction or gravitational collapse or expansion. This process, it's just the star that fuses hydrogen into helium. And at the end of the stage is called the terminal age main sequence, is when the star has exhausted all of its hydrogen content into helium. And after that, it moves on to its red giant or supergiant phase. But I think we'll talk about that later. But right now, we say that after this stage, the nuclear fusion of helium begins. Now, helium would form or fuse together to find other heavier elements such as carbon, and then carbon would fuse after a certain stage to form other heavier elements until it would no longer be able to sustain the gravitational force. So that brings us to the stellar remnants. What happens after when a fusion is no longer possible inside the core of the star? So at this point, the gravity takes over because the gravitational force is too much for the internal force or the nuclear force present inside the star to counteract the gravitational force. So in this case, the star actually it's the end, or you can say the end of the life of a star. So here, the star actually leaves a remnant behind, and these remnants depend on the initial mass of the star with which it was born or with which it progressed its life. So in that case, the stellar remnants would either leave a planetary nebula or a supernova. So what's the difference between a planetary nebula and a supernova? So the thing is, the planetary nebula is a remnant left by a star, which is very less massive. I would say that less massive than 8 solar masses, because our sun is also a small star. So it's expected that after the sun would stop its nuclear fusion in its core, it would leave behind a planetary nebula, which would eventually lead to a white dwarf. So a white dwarf is basically a stellar remnant, which is very bright and has a very hot core. So it will just continue to exist, but its luminosity will not be that much. And furthermore, after that, when it's extinguished all the energy, it would turn into a black dwarf. But it is believed that the universe is not old enough to have seen a black dwarf yet. So that gives us the idea of how long this lifespan of a star is. On the other hand, we talk about supernova, where a star, which is very massive, explodes under the force of its own gravity. That what you see on your screen is a supernova remnant in Crab Nebula, which was first recorded by the Chinese astronomers. So here, in this, what happens in this case is a star which is massive, you can say more massive than 8 solar masses, is unable to fuse more heavier elements into the core of the star. So in that case, what happens once their fusion is no longer possible? In that case, the gravity or the gravitational force of the star exerts pressure inwards, due to which the star starts collapsing. But since there is no nuclear force or nuclear energy in the star, due to which you can counteract that gravitational force, so in that case, the star keeps on collapsing until it's no longer able to handle the pressure exerted from outside. And as a result, it just bursts, leaving shockwave and all the elements that are just spread across the interstellar medium. And these elements that are spread across the interstellar medium are actually very rich in various elements. And these elements are further carried away into the distant universe with the help of stellar winds. And as I said, that these elements, these stellar winds are actually able to propagate these elements into the vast universe. So these elements are actually helpful in playing the role of a molecular cloud. So once this happens, this cloud of dust is actually able to produce new stars. So you see a cycle keeps on going because of that a star is born, then it explodes, and all the nutrients are just traversed across the universe, which are then responsible for the formation of new stars. But apart from that, after a supernova, the core of the star is still there. So it depends on the mass again of the star. If the mass of the star is approximately less than 25 solar mass, you can expect a neutron star as the final remnant. And this neutron star is actually very, very dense. So the core of the core of the star is basically just approximately 10 kilometer in radius, and it has a huge mass. So you can imagine how dense it is. And due to that, due to the principle of conservation of angular momentum, it starts rotating very rapidly, due to which it sends out the magnetic field in the interstellar space. So yeah, that's one thing that we talk about neutron stars. And when it starts pulsating, we name them as pulsars, which are detected further by astronomers. And after that, we talk about black hole. So again, black hole also comes from the remnant of a star which exploded as a supernova. But in this case, the black hole the star should have a mass of more than 25 solar masses, because in that case, then the core is so heavy that it starts pulling things towards itself. And in that case, even the light cannot escape the core. So here, what we get is a black hole in the end. So to summarize all this, you see on your screen is like a life cycle of a star, how it's formed. So the stellar nebula is the place where all the gases and dusts is present. And the stars are formed in this place once they've reached an equilibrium state. And depending on the mass of the star, if it's a small star or an average star, just like our sun, it will just, once it starts fusing helium into heavier elements, it will go into the red giant phase. Whereas for a massive star, it will again go into a red supergiant phase. But once the fusion stops, then you come to the end stage of the star, which can be either a planetary nebula if the star is small, or it can be a supernova if the star is very massive. And here again, it can be either a white dwarf or a neutron star and a black hole, just like as I explained in the previous slide. So this was basically what happens inside a star from start to end, and what processes governs dynamics of stellar evolution. So based on that, I would now like to talk about some of the research work that I'm involved with. So my interests basically focus on stellar winds and atmospheres, and I study the stellar winds of basically massive stars. So what I do to study them is use numerical modeling and simulation methods. And again, for that, some of the principles of physics that I use is basically radiation hydrodynamics, LDI and clumping, and metallicity properties. So again, I'll come back to this image again. So you see that the massive stars are categorized as O and B stars. So my thesis is actually to study the metallicity dependent clumpy winds from hot stars. So my focus lies with stars which are actually over here O and B type of stars. But since I understand that the thesis title is very complicated, I'd like to break down it in small segments. So the hot massive stars, like I said, are the stars with the highest mass that exist in the universe, which I already discussed in the previous slides. Now, what happens in these hot massive stars is that they lose tremendous amount of material in the form of stellar winds. So for less massive stars like our sun, we have coronal winds. For later category of stars, we have dust winds. But for stars such as O and B type of stars, we have radiation-driven winds, because these winds are driven by the enormous radiation force that are present, that is due to the mass of these stars. So basically, when I talk about stellar winds, I don't talk about the winds that we see here on Earth. It's basically stellar winds are those that are due to the enormous amount of eruptions caused due to the you can say the radiation force which lift the material upwards, resulting in a stellar wind. And in this case, a lot of material is ejected into the outer atmosphere. That includes electrons, protons, plasma, and all those sort of things. Now we talk about the clumping. So line-driven winds have basically, they're not very smooth, they're very inhomogeneous, and they have shocks, due to which at some points the density forms clumps, and at some places there are no clumping. So you can say that there are some overdensity due to which these winds are very inhomogeneous in nature. So I studied about the clumping of these winds, and again, what I did was investigated how the property of metallicity affects these clumping. So this is basically how I did my thesis, and yeah, this was the first study to investigate the dependence of clumping on metallicity in line-driven winds. So it's just a theoretical study about how the prediction or how the metallicity would affect a clumping in such a case. But the simulations that I did were actually 1D in one-dimensional. So for that, I actually did some simulations, and these were the results. I made a small video out of it to show you. So in this case, metallicity is represented here with QBAR, you can say. So as you see, I've taken three different metallicities, that is of 2000, 1000, and 400. So basically 2000 represents the metallicity of our own Milky Way galaxy. 1000 represents the metallicity of the Large Magellanic Cloud, and 400 represents the metallicity of the Small Magellanic Cloud. So it's just a comparison of how a star how a massive star was to behave in such an environment. So I'll just play these simulations for you now. Okay. So you see that when the metallicity is high, you see that the density and the velocity, they are producing a lot of shocks as compared to the metallicities in Large Magellanic Cloud and Small Magellanic Cloud. So this affects the clumping and the shocks used. So yeah, this was basically what I studied. I can just play it again. So yeah, you can see that the clumping and the strength is too high as compared to that of a low Magellanic Cloud. So with respect to that, yeah, that's what something we investigated, and we predicted that how a certain star were to behave in different metallicity environments. Okay, so yeah, so this was just a basic contour plot that we came up with. So you see that here, this is the purple color over here depicts the clumps or the clumpy structure in these winds that are ejected from massive stars. So I particularly chose these colors to get a better visualization. So the purple structure you see reduces considerably in the LMC case, and it reduces even more in the SMC case. So that is something that I've been doing for the last year in this aspect. Yeah, so, and again, with this thing, I would like to conclude that based on this result that we did, we established a relation between clumping and the metallicity of stellar winds. And furthermore, what we observed was that there was more clumping in the O supergiant as compared to the B supergiant. But like I said, the simulation was performed in only one-dimensional, and we would further have to study it in two-dimensional or three-dimensional to get a better understanding. There might be some cases that we could have excluded, or we would have not included some aspects of physics, which could be further included in the two-dimensional and three-dimensional, for example, the angle, the clumping structure, and all these kinds of things. And this study was basically, well, the results derived in this thesis were actually, they can be used by the future ELYSIS projects. So ELYSIS is a group of astrophysicists who are currently dealing with all these problems, studying the winds and stellar structure. So during the part of my thesis, I was actually also associated with ELYSIS through my supervisors who are a member in this group. So basically, by doing such theoretical studies, we can obtain empirical constraints for further metallicity regimes. Probably we can also go, or we can also study how a stellar wind for a massive star would behave if it were to be in a galaxy whose metallicity would be less than that of the the LMC or the SMC Magellanic Cloud. So, yep, that was something that I've been doing, and I hope this session would have been a bit informative for you and you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed presenting it. So thank you so much for your attention. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
Hello, Akanksha. This is Sukhjit. First, thank you for the wonderful session. I wanted to ask that you showed that there is a zero age main sequence. Or
yeah, right. I'll just go over here. Yes.
So like this zero age main sequence. So what is the timeline that a star usually spends in this phase?
Star it's just a very early phase. Well, because it's very relative when you talk about different stars. So ZAMS is basically the very, very initial stage when the star is just formed. And once it starts fusing hydrogen into helium in its core, which you can always estimate through numerical computations, there is a code actually called MESA. So there were some things that we did on MESA to estimate and plot the curves. But once this happens, the stars comes to the main sequence. So you can say these are just basically the starting point and end points of the stars. The most of the time, the star would be on the main sequence because it will be in its stable phase.
So it's a relative study, and we actually don't know for sure, like what would be the boundary term which differentiates when it's actually like first it is a protostar and then it enters the main sequence, then it becomes an actual we can say main sequence star, right?
Yeah. Actually, the star that we talk about, for example, our sun, we say that the sun is already a main sequence star. Once the star starts, when the star actually starts fusing hydrogen into helium, because that's the basic thing that every star exhibits. So once that happens, the star will be on the main sequence, and it will be there for almost of its for almost the entirety of its life. But once that stops, once the star doesn't have enough hydrogen to fuse into helium, then we would say that the star would have left the main sequence. That is, you call it the terminal age main sequence, and that means the process has been terminated. But that doesn't mean that the star will explode immediately. It will go into other phases. For example, it will let's say it will fuse more hydrogen atoms. There will be certain processes such as helium flash, helium burning, and all those things, where in the end the envelope would fuse away, and then after that only the core would be remaining. But those are different cycles, and those cycles are very fast, because at that point the star is not very stable, and it will change phases almost very quickly, relatively quickly. By relative, it will take some millions or thousands of years. But yeah, it depends on what the lifespan of a star is. If it's a very small star, the stage would probably take a lot more than that. Sorry, it will take less amount of time. But if it's a massive star, that stage or would be very quickly, because they are very short-lived. Yeah.
Okay, so like it's a variable study. So like you said you use numerical computations. So
Yeah.
exactly what are the mathematical models, or is it a more of a like a physics? Like what is exactly in that numerical model?
Numerical modeling, you mean for this
Yeah.
ZAMS, this particular study? So
Yeah.
okay, so actually there's this code which is called MESA, and it's been created by astronomers and astrophysicists. So they have all the computations. You just have to change some parameters, for example the mass of the star and or the radius of the star and all those things. And based on the physics implemented, it will predict, or it will try to say that how much time the star would be on the main sequence before it goes to the terminal age main sequence. So it will
Basically,
give you,
the equations have been inputted, and
yeah, right,
you just
yeah,
study and like analyze and modify the system a bit
exactly.
as per our.
Yeah, so once you do that, once you set parameters and you run the simulation, it will take some time, and you'll get lots of data and numbers in different columns. So once you get that data, you analyze it, you may try to make sense out of it based on what you are trying to get or what you're trying to study from your data. So based on that, you can predict the cycle of a star, how a certain star would behave after its terminal age main sequence.
Okay, so you were also explaining about this black dwarf star. So like I actually haven't heard about it previously.
Okay.
So can you tell about its characteristics of any, like we know from theoretical studies?
I'm not very expert in black dwarf stars, I would say. Like I said, what I've read is that black dwarf is something of a remnant after a white dwarf. That's why I didn't include it in my slide as well. So what happens is that the lifespan of low mass stars is actually billions of years as compared to a high mass star, which is just millions of years. So like I said, that the universe is actually 14 billion years old. So you can expect that once the star goes through its entire cycle, which is billions of years, and after that, it leaves behind a planetary nebula, and after that, it turns into a white dwarf. And further after that, it's expected that once the star doesn't have enough energy to go through, and there won't be any luminosity, so after that, a black dwarf would be remaining. But since the universe is not old enough to have seen a black dwarf yet, so that's what I studied. So yeah, but that's just some theoretical inferences that were predicted, or that were proposed by various astrophysicists. So even to answer your question, even I'm not a very expert when it comes to black dwarfs.
Just saying theoretically. So if like the star has to have luminosity, if it is to be considered a star,
okay,
like in the basic terms, it has to give off some certain amount of energy. So after the white dwarf has exhausted its fuel, so wouldn't the star actually be considered dead? Then we call black dwarf star, because like it has exhausted fuel. It has to give off some certain type of energy. If it's not given in that energy, then why would you call it a black dwarf star? Because a black dwarf would be something which would be giving black light in just
so
like
it just depends on the
some
terminology
definition.
actually. So I particularly didn't name them white dwarf or black dwarf in that sense. But I would say that, yeah, you were right, that since it's just a dead star, it's just a remnant. So in that case, I don't think it would emit out any light, because all the fusion reactions have stopped in the core. And there's nothing such as nuclear reactions that will be going on to produce more energy. And for every star, the luminosity actually comes from the nuclear reactions that are going on inside the core. But since there are no reactions in core of a stellar remnant, which is actually just an exploded star in case of a supernova, and just white dwarf in case of a less massive star. So ideally, I would expect that for a black dwarf, it would just be a dead star. I don't think it would be radiating any sort of luminosity, and maybe that's why I think they've termed it black dwarf.
Okay. You also mentioned that there is a QBAR that you in your research you studied the system for different type QBARs. So what is the like application of QBAR? Like you said that for Milky Way it's 2000.
So QBAR is basically the thing is, we represent the metallicity of different galaxies, or the metallicity environments of different stars with respect to QBAR. So QBAR is actually a term which was introduced by Professor Kenneth Cayley. So he was studying about this, and yeah, so he introduced this term QBAR it's a very simple term to represent the metallicity parameters. So it's a standard metallicity parameter for Milky Way galaxy, and similarly for Large Magellanic Cloud and Small Magellanic Cloud. So yeah, so basically I just set those parameters, and I tried. It's again just an empirical study. It has not been proven, or it's not observed or experimented upon. It's just a theoretical study where I've derived, or we have performed simulations based on this particular criteria.
What do these simulations represent? That like this tan theta graph that we are seeing here?
Tan theta graph?
Oh, I'm sorry. Like what does this graph represents?
So actually, this graph is the density graph, and this graph is the velocity graph. I can play the simulation again for you. So you see that more the metallicity would be present in this atmosphere. You see that the density, which could be a smooth profile, is actually very inhomogeneous. You see very shocks in the density profile as well as the velocity profile. So that's what we tried to do over here. What we did was we believe that, or we know that from studies, is that the stellar winds for massive stars is not very smooth. It's very, very inhomogeneous, and contains of very dense clumps of mass, or you can say matter. By clumps, I mean that it's just an over density in some points of the wind as compared to the rest of the wind. So that's what we studied, and these shocks that you saw were actually due to the inhomogeneities present. So I studied how QBAR metallicity would affect the strength of these shocks.
So, like based on research, like what would you like suggest that actually happens? Like basically hypothetical study. For example, if a star formation structure was to be proposed near this system, then how would this inhomogeneity would affect that system in particular?
Well, I haven't studied that in that aspect, so I don't think I'm very qualified to answer this particular question. What I did study was about the stellar winds, that how certain, like I said, certain parameters, in this case metallicity, would affect the strength of the wind, and how the clumping would be affected. But like I said, stellar winds are responsible for carrying away all the elements to the vast spaces of the universe. And since radiation-driven stellar winds are actually very powerful, so they would be capable to take certain amounts of materials into the nearby molecular clouds or nearby star-forming regions. So that would probably help the formation of new stars.
Okay.
Hi, Akanksha. Thank you so much for a wonderful session. I have a question. So you mentioned the equation of equilibrium between gravity and nuclear energy. So could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So like I said, that apart from that, there are certain other terms associated with this, that is degeneracy, pressure, and all those things. But just to keep it simple, I just included the basic terms, that is the pressure, the pressure from inside the star, which is represented by this term, versus the gravitational pressure, which is coming from the outside towards the inside. And here is your basic acceleration term. So once, in order to simplify it, once an equilibrium stage is reached, so this term actually cancels or it becomes zero, and you're basically left with an equilibrium stage. So that in certain aspects, I would say that the pressure, whatever is happening inside, whether it's an electron pressure, degeneracy pressure, and all those sorts of things, the net pressure, which is due to the core or the nuclear reactions going on in the star, is able to balance the force, the gravitational force of the star. Yeah, but just to keep these terms simple, I've just denoted this overall pressure.
Thank you. One last question. Can you define metallicity of a star?
Yes, so metallicity of a star is basically the elements that would be present in the atmosphere of the star, or you would say the photosphere of the star. So for example, since our sun is a very small star, it's believed that sun would not be able to explode into a supernova. It will just be in a planetary nebula phase. And that means that it won't be able to fuse heavier elements, I think after carbon. So I'm not sure, but yeah, I have to see that. But the thing is that it won't be able to undergo heavier nuclear fusion cycles as compared to massive stars such as O and B. So what happens is, for massive stars, they actually, due to the large amount of nuclear fuel in their core, they're able to fuse heavier elements. They can even go beyond carbon to fuse other heavier elements like oxygen and all those elements that come in the periodic table, until of course it reaches iron, which is the very stable stage. And after that, so yeah, these elements in the core of the massive star are actually lead to the heavier elements in the production of heavier elements. So that's what we hear to as metallicity.
So can we define metallicity? Would I be right to understand metallicity as the heaviest element a given star can produce?
By metallicity, you just don't mean that it's like the heaviest element. By metallicity, it's a very broad term that any element heavier than helium is considered as metallicity. So even for sun, we would say that the metallicity parameter is a certain, let's say a certain value. And for a massive star, we would say that the metallicity parameter again would be a certain value. So I don't think that we basically mean that the heaviest element produced, but yeah, we mean by the amount of heavier elements that would have a combined effect on the evolution of the star. That would be termed as metallicity.
Thank you.
Ma'am, I had a small doubt. Why OB stars have high metallicity? I read somewhere that OB stars have high metallicity. If they have high metallicity, then why they are so massive?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you properly. Could you repeat your question, please?
He's saying why OB stars have high metallicity. He read somewhere about.
Yeah, like I explained that OB stars are actually very metallic in nature because of the production of heavier elements that goes on into their core. So everything that a star experiences comes down to what's happening inside the core and the mass of the star. So apart from that, for massive stars, that there are actually massive stars actually exhibit radiation-driven winds. So radiation basically is due to the amount of metal lines or spectral lines or all those elements present in the photosphere, due to which it results in a heavier metallicity as compared to a low massive star, which is unable to produce so much heavier elements inside its core.
Means the source cloud from which the stars were produced were actually low metallicity. If they had low metallicity, that's why the stars were so big.
I'm so sorry, but I think I'm not able to catch your question properly. There's a lot of disturbance and noise. If it's okay, could you type it in the chat?
Yes, ma'am.
In the meantime, someone else can ask the question.
Akanksha, can you please explain what does PR in this hydrostatic equation represent?
Okay, so PR is basically the pressure gradient over here. So the pressure exerted in the star is not the same everywhere. So if you would imagine the star to be divided in shells, in concentric shells, you would say that the pressure inside would be too much as compared to the pressure outside. So this is just a representation for the pressure gradient, and it depends on the distance of the shell that we are taking from the center of the star. So that's why we are using this term R, like it depends on the radial distance.
Okay, so d square R by dt square, I mean this pressure, this equation should represent the velocity, right?
Well, if you do the dimensional analysis, I don't know if it would give the velocity term, but yeah, what astrophysicists usually use this term as is as pressure gradient.
Okay. Basically, like what does the like PR d square R by dt square, like what does this term on the whole represent?
This is not
like
PR dt square, this is rho R actually, this is the density.
Rho R. Okay,
Yeah,
so like
and this is the density. So, yeah, so this is a hydrostatic equation basically in terms of the density and in terms of the gradient. So basically you should focus on this here, the acceleration term, which is again represents the force. And this is the term, this is the force, which is due to the inside, due to the nuclear reactions that are going on the inside, due to which the energy produced with that exerts a pressure on the surface of the star, like towards the outside. And over here, this term represents against the gravitational force. So basically, if there's an equilibrium, this term would be 0, and you would just get the hydrostatic equilibrium stage.
Okay, so like this term at one point that is the radial distance reaches 0, and at that point the equilibrium is determined.
Sorry, the radial distance?
Like the square by dt square, this term at one particular distance from the center of the star, it
no, it's not that when this particular term goes 0 that you get a hydrostatic equilibrium, because if R is equal to 0, you'd be just at the core of the star. So of course the core is very unstable. What R here represents is that the distance from the core of the star. So basically we are talking about pressure gradient here, and like I said, that the pressure is different in different shells of the star. So if I were to take, let's say, this particular part, the pressure would be more here as compared to the outer part, let's say a shell which is outside of this of these arrows. So here this just denotes about how much pressure we are talking about. But in overall terms, whatever pressure, it's like the combined pressure of all these shells is enough to counterbalance the force which is due to the gravity. And here we obtain like a hydrostatic equilibrium. So basically you don't see the star exploding, or you don't see the star contracting for now. They do at the end of their lives, but that's why, because they are actually very stable, and this is the equation from which they're this is the equation governing this.
Okay, thank you.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yeah, sure.
Ma'am, a while ago, one of the participants, Ashay, he had asked a question, and you had asked him to put forth the doubt on the chat box. I guess he's placed the same. If possible, could you please answer it? It was a pretty interesting doubt.
I think I have to stop share this to read it. Okay. Okay. The cloud from which OB stars were born had low metallicity. Okay, so the clouds from which OB stars were born had low metallicity. I would say that particularly no, because since the most I wouldn't say that they have low metallicity or high metallicity, but what I would say that the cloud is actually enriched in various different nutrients, because if the cloud actually is due to the presence of a supernova or due to the remnants left behind by planetary nebula, and all those combination of all these things depends upon the size or the gene's mass stability. So once the molecular cloud, irrespective of whether it has high metallicity or low metallicity, once it reaches a certain stage, it actually starts going in fragments. And once those fragments became very stable, so this process is called fragmentation. And once those fragments are actually very stable, then you say that a star is born. And again, depending on the size of the star, if it's a very small star, I wouldn't say that the star would actually have a high metallicity in the core. But if the molecular cloud is very large and it's forming into a very large star, if the fragment is very large, in that case, the star would again go through the cycle. It would produce heavier elements after reaching the terminal age main sequence. And once that happens, it will again go through the other stages of nuclear fusion, and it'll in the end blow up to be a supernova, and the cycle would go on. Hello? Okay.
Okay. Is there any other doubts? Akshay Kadu, you're raising a hand. Ashay Kadu.
Sir, I have written in the chat out. My doubt means the following.
So you say that you have read somewhere that if cloud has high metallicity, then the stars which are produced are of low mass. Well, there's something that I don't know about this particular fact, but if it could be an interesting fact. So at that point, I would say that I would have to look up more into this aspect before I can answer your question properly. Any more further questions?
Okay, so if there are no more doubts, I think we can conclude the session. Thank you very much, Akanksha, for joining. It was a very wonderful session. I think many of us got very valuable information from your session. Thank you very much. We hope to have you